Should we get started?
Okay.
Yes, I get a sign from back there, and I think that sign means that we're supposed to get started. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in Perugia and joining us for this panel where we're going to talk about product and all things product. How is the relationship between content and product? How is it changing? What does it mean for newsrooms and news organizations? I'm very excited about our panel here. I also want to say before we get started that the person who actually suggested this fantastic topic sadly can't be here, Dmitry Shishkin, because of a terrible family tragedy, and our thoughts are with him, and we wish he was here, and he had really the idea of this panel, so I want to thank him for that via this way. My name is Anita Zielina. I spent quite a few years as media executive, both on the editorial and then I think what you would call the digital and product side of things. And now I'm based in New York City, and I run a variety of programs at CUNY that focus on empowering people who are in the digital and product space and leaders who are in that space. So I'm very excited. It's a topic that I'm very passionate about. And I have a super amazing guest list here from two colleagues who also came to us with long flights and probably, you know, some jet lag left over from New York City. Louise Story and Millie Tran, thank you so much for being here with us today. And what we thought we could do is just to kind of get us started into this, you know, into this topic, is I'll kind of pass the mic to them. They have their own mics, but I virtually basically pass the mic to them, and would kick us off with the question of, tell us a little bit about your career and tell us if that actually counts as a product career. Were you always in product? Did it kind of, you know, end up there? Because I think the question of career trajectories is one that's very interesting. So before I ask Louise, just as an FYI, we are actually going to, you know, disrupt the world a little bit, and we are not going to follow this. We are going to let you ask questions, but there is not going to be a mic. So after kind of the first 20-something minutes, I'll invite everyone to ask questions. You need to stand up and you need to speak up. And I'm going to repeat the question into the microphone so that the stream can pick it up. So with that, Louise.
Thanks. Really glad to be here with you all. So my basic bio is I started and really remain a journalist and an MBA. So I started my career both pursuing reporting, investigative reporting, covering the financial crisis of 2008 in the US and Europe. I uncovered 2 multi-billion-dollar fraud cases, as well as another one for $550 million. My husband says we could be really well off if I'd gotten a cut of those, but didn't. But at the same time, I went to business school at the beginning of my career, and there really, from the start, I was interested in what would happen to our industry. I love working with data sets, and that's been involved in a lot of my reporting. You know, I was very interested in marketing and thinking about how you're reaching people, and so it's just gone through my career that way. My first beat at the New York Times, where I was for just about 12 years, was covering advertising, marketing, and the media. And so there I was writing about our industry, and then I did other reporting, and then ended up involved in some strategy at the New York Times, working on the innovation report and some other strategic reports there. Then I went to the Wall Street Journal, where I was for 3 years. I was the chief news strategist running coverage strategy and also alternating as weekend acting editor. And then I was also the chief product and technology officer, so that kind of cuts across the whole business. Since then, I, on an interim basis, ran the newsroom at Planet Money and enjoyed that. I'm writing a book on the racial wealth gap. I'm teaching at Yale Columbia, and I'm excited to be here.
Fabulous. Great job in summarizing that amazing bio in 1.5 minutes. Millie, let's see how well you do summarizing your amazing bio.
I'll try to be quick. I'm currently the VP of Content Strategy and Growth, and please, at Conde Nast, and please don't ask me what that actually means, because I've actually spent my whole career with different titles that feel made up, and I think that is because I'm always trying to find and anticipate the next problem to solve. Actually what I do at Conde Nast is I'm on the kind of content and editorial teams, and I work to bridge those teams with the rest of the business. So that means I'm working with the product and tech teams, I'm working with the data teams, the strategy teams, our finance, HR, our sales team, our revenue teams. So I'm basically an ambassador for the content teams and try to voice and represent their needs and interests. Before that, I was the Chief Product Officer at the Texas Tribune. It's a nonprofit newsroom based in Austin, Texas. We're actually Stacy Maria Ishmael, who was the editorial director there. We work together. So it's kind of a great, it's great to have her here because we can talk about kind of the role of the editor-in-chief and the role of the Chief Product Officer and how these roles are different and how they work together and how I think they will eventually just become one role in the future. My career has basically been spent in media in various roles and companies. Before the Texas Tribune, I was the deputy off-platform editor at the New York Times, where I oversaw the social and off-platform teams. So basically, anywhere you saw the New York Times that wasn't our owned and operated platforms. So thinking a lot about audiences, how people get news, and before that, I was the global growth editor. And before that, I was at Buzzfeed in several roles working on international growth and translation adaptation. Who want this? Who are we making this for? And then the tech piece is that feasibility piece, right? Can we actually make it? And that's where that interdisciplinary comes from. Do we have the tools and technology to actually execute on it and launch it? And then viability. So what's the revenue model for it? Can we make money from this? And I think when you take kind of that product thinking and apply it in a newsroom, you throw in like journalism ethics and journalism integrity. How do you make these things in a way that isn't just going to exploit people's like needs and meet their need of getting information to like live their lives and participate in the world? So I think that's how I think about product. And yes, very, very interdisciplinary, and I think having a little bit of knowledge about each of those things helps you pull all of these things together.
So obviously anyone who ever worked in a somehow matrixed organization, whether that's a small or a large one, I think will attest to the fact that working in interdisciplinary teams and in a matrix with like complicated, power shifts and movements and teams that sometimes collaborate but sometimes compete, that it doesn't always, go down without conflict, or it doesn't always go down without like just kind of some redefinition of who's responsible for what. Mm-hmm. Let's focus a little bit on that because I think that's one of the topics when we talk about this that usually comes as a question of like, what if I built this product team in the newsroom? Is that team or should that team take away something from editorial? Should it live under editorial? Is conflict or is kind of, creating something new, is there an inherent element that we have to have of like some kind of struggle?
Well, I'll start. So I think we can't lump the newsroom all together as one monolith because there's a lot of different people in a newsroom, right? You've got reporters and graphics designers and photographers and videographers, and you have copy editors, and you have mid-level managers, and you have senior level managers. And I do not think that you would be, if you are taking something away, that it would be equally from all of them. In fact, I don't think it would even on a regular basis kind of hit most of them, right? So I think that where the struggle comes down a little bit is that in some organizations, the most senior level editors in a newsroom, before there were product units, were making most of the product type calls. And as product has become a bigger force in media companies, there's more of a collective conversation that needs to be had, not only with product and the editor-in-chief, but also with the revenue folks and so on. So I think if it's taking anything away, it's not again, it wasn't usually a reporter who would have been making a big strategic decision. The other point I want to make on that is I think it has to do with having clarity around the increments in time that people act primarily in their roles. So people running coverage, for example, of Washington are putting out excellent stories every day, every week. They might be planning some long-term, big article projects, but that's relatively short-term. And I think one of the things that strategic planning and product management can do the best is to look in bigger increments of time, look ahead, take the times to do look backs and reviews, which people in the flow of news don't always have time to do. So if people can get comfortable with different cadences, they can really complement each other.
Right, Millie?
I love what you said about kind of the different time horizons, because yeah, I do think like news, if you're thinking about breaking news, happens at a different pace than like product cycles, right? Like you have to, it takes much longer to build an app than it does to write a story, as a breaking news story. I know there are some people who write longer stories too. But yeah, I think just going back to the power struggle, I think one of the ways I see product working in news organizations is to be a kind of tiebreaker between all of those differing incentives, right? And I think one way to think about the differing incentives is if you go to a homepage, you can kind of see it where there's like a banner ad, you're like, oh, they're an advertising-driven company, that's how they make money. And then you're like, oh, wait, I got a pop-up screen to like be a subscriber too, and you're like, oh, they're also a subscription business, so they're like making money through people, making money through advertisers, and I think you can see those like different strategies like expressed in the product, and I think that's a bad product experience, right? Because you don't want to see a banner ad and a pop-up and another pop-up. So I think when you see great products, you like those things kind of become invisible, and it makes sense to just see like, oh, like I understand their business, I understand what they're doing. It's one experience. So I think one way product can help that is like mediate through user needs, right? So I think there's a big part of like product that is about user research and really understanding the needs so you can meet them by different types of content or different distribution strategies. But I'm not sure I guess this, like, and being an internal optimist, like, I don't see it as an adversarial relationship. I think I mentioned Stacy and our work at the Texas Tribune because she was editorial director, I was the chief product officer, and the way we worked was to, like, kind of be on the same page all the time, and I think you're going to see that more because the way you experience a news story, it's completely, like, inseparable from how you experience it. So it's like the web page you're seeing it on, does it load fast? What about all those ads and like the user experience? It like it affects how you read and consume that story. So I think, sorry for the history lesson here and the long answer, but like when print newspapers were big, like the newsroom didn't really have to think about the audience in the same way because it was kind of taken care of by advertising, and so they had no idea about the audience needs. And now that like things are online and we get data and we like understand what people want and need from us in a more direct way, you can build that relationship and you can learn from it and like meet people's needs because that's much more clear now and there's no middleman of like advertisers. So.
I love that answer, and I love that point you made, and we talked about that before a little bit, before that panel, of mediation, right? So there is a certain element that at least we felt we'd agree on of mediation, translation between those disciplines, negotiation, facilitation. And I also love that the point that you brought in about basically what you do is you shield the user from seeing that movement behind the scenes, right? So it's really the user centricity at the core to kind of shield the user. I think it's fair to say that product structures, so basically where product sits in the newsroom, who it reports to, who decides on the budget, that this is still kind of a work in progress to a certain extent, and that there are a variety of ways product can be structured, a variety of places product can be housed. From your experience, and not necessarily just your current organization, but also your past ones, are there better and worse ways how to structure product? Are there better and worse ways in terms of product should live under X or product should not report to XYZ?
I love an organizational design question. I think there is no like right answer. I think it really depends on the organization. I think it depends on the people. One of our other panelists that couldn't be here is Kat Downs, and she's at the Washington Post where she's the chief product officer, but she reports both to the chief technology officer and also the executive editor in the newsroom. So I think that's one way to kind of pull both of those needs together. So the needs of the newsroom, the priorities of the newsroom, and also pull in the kind of priorities of the tech roadmap, for example. So I think that's one way. I think at the Text Tribune, in my role as Chief Product Officer, I reported to the CEO, the editorial director reported to the CEO, and we kind of worked together in alignment. So I don't think there's one right way. I think it depends on whether the person has that background and skill set to kind of dual report to product and the newsroom. And I think something I've noticed is that if you haven't worked, and Louise, you're a great example of like being a reporter for many years and understanding how stories are made, you can understand like for them, and then you can also understand the needs of the audience and how they experience it. So I think having more kind of news people are not
focusing on the audience, on the user, on technology, because we're talking a lot about product, but product, I was Chief Product and Technology Officer. Sometimes there's different people in those two roles, a CPO and a CTO, and product is often, they're making the roadmaps around what technology is building. So people who are leading product are often in the mix speaking up for what all the engineers are doing. You really have to understand engineering. And so I think it just needs to report to someone who believes technology is important in the company, who believes in looking to teams and empowering them to be involved in solutions and giving prompts and questions and looking to teams for solutions. And one of the challenges in some news companies is that sometimes there's a top-down culture, and that can be a clash with product and technology. So I think it could be any of the different parties, the publisher, the head of revenue, the editor-in-chief, depending on kind of whose strength and interest is the strongest in this, or if you want the CPTO to be kind of their standalone thing.
I'm glad you basically, we seamlessly kind of went to the topic of leadership and the kind of leadership that product leadership involves. And I'd like to spend a little time on that, because I think the point that you just made also makes clear, and we had a panel on leadership and changing leadership this morning where we talked about the new skills and new behaviors that leaders in journalism need to learn if suddenly, even if you are an editorial leader, you're also leading technologists, you're also leading marketing managers, you're also leading data scientists. How do you do that properly? Can you reflect a little bit on your journey as a leader in product/product adjacent fields? Is there an advice that you would give your kind of younger self as a leader in product that you would like to follow, Louise?
Sure. There are a few things I learned, over the past 10 years as I got closer and closer to product and to strategy, and then ultimately went on to lead them. So first of all, it's really important as a leader to be transparent, very communicative, respectful to all people of all backgrounds and all disciplines. I know this sounds like table stakes, but actually it doesn't always happen in action. And then also to provide people with context about why you're doing things. So you will get much, much better answers back from people instead of telling them what they have to go do, tell them what you're trying to achieve, ask them to try to think of some solutions. When they come back, you might just not sign off blindly, you'll talk it through, but I think that kind of give and take and listening to your teams is essential for anyone you manage in a company today, and moreover, younger workers expect it.
Millie?
I love what you said about kind of explaining the context and the why. I think, especially if you're working with a bunch of journalists who are skeptical by default and don't have problems with authority, you want to be able to explain why and kind of the goal, because they might find a different way to get there. Journalists are also the best hacks, right? They need the CMS to do something, and it doesn't work that way, so they'll figure something out, and you'll realize 5 years later, why did we have this weird workflow? So I think that's really important. I think if I were to boil it down to two things, it would just be empathy and curiosity. So I think empathy for understanding all those different ways that people work. I think engineers might think about something way differently than your designer or reporter or an editor or your salesperson, and really trying to understand all of those perspectives, empathizing them, and then being curious about it first, right? And not assuming anything about like why they might be doing something. I think those two things help you align goals, because I think what product is about, like, to me, making things for people. And how do we do that if not by aligning and using all these different teams and resources around our companies?
Yeah, and we are basically circling back to the alignment issue and the kind of connection and collaboration and translation issue, which is great. If you basically, I know many folks in the audience come from large organizations, but many also will come from smaller newsrooms that not necessarily have the luxury of, a Wall Street Journal or Dow Jones or Conde Nast or New York Times or NZZ Media Group of being able to say, let's build a product team with like 100 folks. What would be your advice if someone in the audience is now listening and says, well, you know what, I'm in a smallish news organization. I understand the importance of product, but where do we start? What team do we have to build? What roles have to be there immediately from the start? Any advice on how to get that started?
I think if you're starting from scratch and you're at a smaller place, then it's really important that your few leaders that you have can wear multiple hats effectively. And so ideally, your editor-in-chief will also really believe in the power of, both being an editor-in-chief for the audience and for the journalist and the content, being in equal parts focused, and then your editor-in-chief can carry a lot of weight on that. I think you can also, it really helps to be specific when you're trying to tackle a problem and roles. So you can take, for example, what do editors do, what do product people, and boil them into pieces and figure out where they stack up. And since you're a new company, you're redefining things, you don't have to do it the same way. So you could say, for example, just one example, traditionally in newsroom, editors, assign stories, approve stories, and they curate what's on the homepage, for example. Well, is curation necessarily an editor thing or not? And you do the same thing with product function. You could re-look at like the 5 major components of different parts of a media company and see whether you think for your org any different assortment of them would make sense.
I actually think I've worked at small companies and big companies. I worked at the American Press Institute, which is a journalism think tank based in the U.S. And we relaunched it with a team of 4 people, and I think it's actually easier to do like product thinking in a smaller organization because you're not we talked about that diplomacy and like shuttling back and forth between teams. You don't have that, right? You can just do it, and you can focus on the user. You can make something, you can test it and learn from it, and you can iterate. That's like product thinking, right? And I think if you don't have the tech team, for example, you don't have to build an app. You can make an email newsletter and learn from your audience. I think product is really about the content or the product, and the community and the audience at the other end of it, right? Everything in between is how you get there, and hopefully how you make money from it. But that's really, if you can simplify it down to that, if you're an editor working on a story, you probably are thinking a lot about stories in the same way a product person might, which is, who's the audience for this? How might I write this headline in a way that is interesting to this reader? On this platform, it might change for another reason. And if I test that and realize that people aren't reading that, can I change it and iterate and test and learn from it and do something else? So I think it's actually easier. And like you said, Louise, you don't have to follow any rules. You can learn the rules to break them. But you can kind of build from scratch. And I think one other thing is, in product, it's very different building something from scratch than it is making something better, right? One is much more expansive. You're thinking about kind of the problem, boiling it down to the need, and kind of looking at resources about how you can tackle that and solve that problem. But when you take a product that's already existing, you can change things one by one, and it's a much longer and more patient process. And it's you can choose which one you like better, but much more fun to just build something. So
So one of the many hats I wear, and shameless plug alert, is as board chair of the News Product Alliance, which is kind of a new association for news product thinkers. And that emerged from, and you can sign up on the newsproduct.org for the free Slack, and we'd love to have you. But the real point that I want to make is it was partly created out of this feeling that many of us and many people we talked to shared of feeling a certain amount of loneliness in their role. So one of the sentiments when we kind of did the initial research was, well, I kind of, no one understands me in my organization. I'm kind of, my editor doesn't really, know what I do when I talk about user centricity. My peers don't understand it, my board doesn't understand it, and this kind of need for a community and for kind of mutual support and shared reflection and shared learning. And I can personally say from my experience that I had a lot of that I feel like when I kind of grew up in product-y roles, I often sometimes kind of doubted if, I'm wrong or a lot of other people are wrong because, I just felt like, I think this is the way we should be going, but why is no one else kind of doing that? And for me, it was revelatory to find out that there are other people in many different kind of fields and associations that do similar work. If someone is here today and feels like I'm doing this, but I feel like I don't kind of, I still haven't persuaded the rest of my organization. Can you maybe share, did you also have throughout your career moments where you felt like I need support, or I feel lonely in my decisions, or I feel kind of misunderstood in my product centricity in a way?
I think for me, I'll talk about Buzzfeed here. So when I joined to help launch the news app, we started with an email newsletter because it's much, like I said, it's much easier to launch a newsletter than it is to build an app. It takes more time, more resources, more energy, more everything. And what we did with the email was I tested a bunch of ways of writing voice, how what sections we might put. We tested it with this small closed Facebook group as a way to learn about how people were responding to something. And we were doing that, and we launched it, and we launched it in beta, and then we iterated, and we kept kind of evolving it. We made design changes because we realized people want a more skimmable newsletter than just blocks of text. So we were working with the designers on that. We were working with the support team on people sending in questions. And it wasn't until later, much later in my career, that I realized oh, that's product thinking. I was working as an editor, but that's product thinking and working, right? Because you're making something and you're testing it, and then you're working with other teams or yourself to change it based on what you've learned about how people have responded to it. So I go back to that and just think sometimes you don't have a name for what you're doing, but if you understand all the steps that go into this, you most likely have realized you've been doing this all along. And I think that's where that loneliness comes in, from not having a name to the work you're already doing. So
amazing. Yeah.
One of the things I've really enjoyed the most in my career is getting to work on many efforts that have been people pulled from a lot of different disciplines working together on projects. I got to work on several things like that at the Times, and then the nature of my team at the Journal was just like that. So I would say because of those, I never felt totally isolated because I was just often in a room of people from different corners, and so I felt very supported in the idea that there are all these different people. But a couple thoughts I will share in case any of you all have thought about this, and it connects to something Millie said I think is an important point to drive home, is if you feel like you're kind of alone doing product, well, is your organization actually behind doing product? Are they actually doing product thinking, or they just say they do product? Because a lot of places are really primarily just optimizing their products. They're not really creating a product or really that open to large changes, if that's really what would create value and be of interest and useful to the audiences. So I think it can feel more lonely and more challenging if you're essentially part of more of an optimizing team, if they don't call it that, that's what some places are doing, versus if you're creating something new, you're really following that process. So I think it's good to soul search a little bit about what you want to be doing as a product thinker. Do you want to be improving something that you think is really great already and you're helping to optimize it, which there can be great value in that if you love the thing and you think it should be the same. Or if you think we're really going to be doing product thinking, we'll create new things when it makes sense, are you part of an organization that wants to do that?
Yeah, great answer. We're going to open it up to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we will try to answer them. Any questions from the audience? Yes, and please speak as loud as you can. Thank you for that question, and I'll just repeat it for the stream. So basically, you're a journalist working in an interdisciplinary team with designers and so forth, and you enjoy it, but you also sometimes feel that you speak different languages. And I think that's an excellent point. Who wants to say something about that?
I mean, so first, Craig, just keep doing more of that and keep welcoming people from different disciplines to work with you. It will get easier. And actually, you know, so many people who work in engineering at news companies have chosen to be at those companies because they love news and maybe they were a reporter for their college paper or maybe they want to also write. So just embrace that gap and it will become smaller.
I think I was on a different panel talking about news product recently, and Kim Fox of Cal Matters and Charo Henrique of the New York Times, we started coming up with a bunch of parallels from product and newsrooms, and you know, a big part of product thinking is research, and that's reporting, essentially, right? A lot of product teams have daily stand-ups. That's like a daily news meeting. There's another thing of like, when you're just starting out on a beat, you're like trying different things to like build sources, and like that's just trying different things and iterating on it. And I think another kind of way to bridge like vocabulary, which I know it feels so silly to think about like vocabulary, right? But it's like a large part of the translation thing where you'll hear things like agile versus waterfall. And if you can like build connections to how reporters are thinking, how you are thinking about it and how they're thinking about it, you'll actually find a lot of parallels. Like if you're thinking about like waterfall, that's much more like an enterprise or big investigative story where everything is really planned out. Everything needs to be sequential and like really bulletproof. Whereas agile might mean like people are responding to things because like a breaking news story happened. Not everything might be right. You're putting things out there and you're like with the best of your knowledge. So I think trying to make those parallels and understanding, again, with that like curiosity and empathy, like a lot of what you're doing is probably very similar. You're both trying to solve problems just in a different way.
And maybe one last, those were great answers. One last point to add. I think the curiosity and empathy also extends to the point where I think assumptions are a dangerous thing. And I kind of learned that myself, right? Sometimes you kind of go into a meeting and you assume what the person on the other side of the table wants. It's like with a negotiation, right? You walk in and you're like, I kind of know what the tech people want or the product people or the editorial folks. And one thing I learned at least is that sometimes you don't, right? Mm-hmm. It's an assumption and you're not in someone else's shoes, and empathy also means like trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And maybe you have aligned goals, you just kind of assume that you don't.
We did a weekly meeting for a few years at the Journal, which a lot of people really liked, where we would do half the meeting, a journalist, reporter talking about a story they had that had done really well and talking openly, though, what could be better with it, you know, what worked, what didn't work, openly taking questions, and people would offer suggestions or things that were, you know, could be changed. And then the other half of the meeting, with the same attendees, which was a mix of people from all over, was about something new that the mobile app team was working on. And actually, both sides, the reporters who came, as well as the engineers or the designers, the data scientists who came, like, really liked the opportunity to ask each other questions. And you may not realize this, but when you're running around a newsroom super busy, people feel like they don't get to ask anyone about what they're doing. So taking the time to share with each other can help.
Absolutely. Further questions from the audience? Yes. So just to repeat the question from Renee, yes, we all had hybrid roles, and the question is, some of these roles had strategy in them. How important is it to have those strategy roles? Can they be embedded in those roles, or should there be, or are there other strategic or strategy roles in the newsroom?
I mean, I can talk about my time at the New York Times. I started as global growth editor, which was very much like a strategy role about how do we grow our international audience. I'd look at data reports. I work closely with our data team. Every week and month, I'd see like numbers go up and down and be like, why? Why did they go up and down this week or month? And it wasn't until my second job at the Times, which is deputy off-platform editor, where I was really in the news flow every day, and I could tell you by the end of the month, like, our numbers are going to go down because we were slow on this story, we missed this story, and like we didn't have any big enterprise stories that were like resonant. Or I could tell you that like we're gonna actually have a big month because there was a big breaking news event. We actually were like the first and best on this story, and like competitively we really performed well on like some Oscars coverage or something. So I think like the strategy is good, and it's important to understand those frameworks and how to put them all together, but it really is about like the execution, and I think that's where understanding news is really important, because you can understand the different levers that make things change. So I feel very strongly that like strategy needs to be met with good execution, right? Because like I think if you've been in media long enough now, like there are only so many ways to make money. Like the strategy is pretty like straightforward at this point, I would say. It's like, don't ask me about NFTs or the metaverse, but like, like for now, in our current present, like the strategy is pretty clear, and I think it really is about executing and really about like pulling the best of your organization to execute on that strategy. But I think you can have like doing roles where you make things and then learn strategy separately too. I think if you go too long without making anything, I think it doesn't, like your strategy becomes too abstract and like theoretical.
I mean, one thing that I'll add, and that was a great answer, Millie, is that one thing that I see often when I work with leaders who often are in these like producty, like senior but not like top CEO level or editor-in-chief level roles, is that this kind of, in executive program we call it like that bridging the strategy execution gap element. Yeah. If that is missing, it's dangerous for an organization. If you have like a C-level or senior leadership kind of floating around at the 50,000 feet level and having bold and bright and shiny ideas, and then you have people doing great work on the 50 feet level, but there is no one to kind of translate in between and kind of make sure that these things kind of grip into each other and actually gain traction. I think that is when the organization doesn't create results, and that's often what I see happening often is that then criticism kind of pops up, like, oh, now we have all these kind of product folks and innovation folks, but there is actually nothing happening on the bottom line, no new, kind of everything is slower, nothing kind of gets out the door, and I feel that, I would say that is probably connected to that lack of like strategic alignment in those roles. So I do feel those roles are important. Do they have to be called strategy? Well, I don't necessarily think so, because all the names of all these roles we all had and so many others are kind of somehow made up, right? You can call them strategy or digital innovation, transformation, impact, new audience, growth, trajectory, whatever.
Yeah, I think being able to like work at both of those altitudes is really important. Like you should know how like, you know, the lowest ranked person in your newsroom works and like be able to connect that to like the editor-in-chief's vision. And I think that that's really important. And it takes just like humility and again, curiosity and empathy to do that, so.
Further questions from the room for the group? Just give it a second before I jump in. Yes. Sorry, can you speak up a tiny bit?
Thinking about like the product being so new and in a way challenging a lot of things that say, okay, I work in journalism, but I didn't do with product. Are you a journalist? Well, and also thinking about how to become the product. Like what is it about? Like the kind of skills that someone wants to go
Yeah.
should work that you recommend.
So basically, what skills do you need if you're either a journalist and want to transition into product, or maybe you just kind of start out in the industry, but what skills do you need as someone in product? And that's a great question because both of you hired and are hiring a tremendous amount of people in roles. Can you talk a little bit about the skill set that someone should have?
I think it's good for anyone who wants to work in journalism to spend a few years as a reporter. I just think it's so central, understanding, you know, how you go about finding out new information and you know, and especially if you can spend a few years as a reporter that's also does pay attention to the audience and does, you know, I think it's great. I think increasingly it's just imperative people can work with data and are very comfortable with data. And I don't mean just like a metrics PDF that's sent to you, but like think about, okay, so if we give out this metric to this team, what is that going to incentivize them to do? Or where's the selection bias in this? Like think on a sophisticated level about data. I also think most people going in the media should know at least some basic programming. It's important both to types of reporting as it is to being involved in engineering the product. And so those are the areas I think would be really good as a foundation.
I don't mean to sound like you don't need to know anything, but I actually don't think, and we were just talking about how we should find areas where we disagree because we agree on everything, but I actually don't think...
We were so afraid that we'd agree on everything.
I actually don't think you need to be a reporter or know programming. I was a writer and reporter in college and like realized I was like bad at it and didn't want to do it anymore, but I love journalism and news. And I like built websites growing up with like HTML and CSS. But
programming.
Yeah, but like, you know, you don't need to like learn SQL, right? You don't need to like know C++. I also tried to take computer science in college and like it was too much work. Because I was also in the student newspaper. So like, I don't think you need to like know, you can't be an expert in everything, right? But I think what you can do is like understand enough to be able to talk with people and understand their work. So if you're able to talk with an engineer and like understand how they think about what they do and how long something takes, I think a lot of times people in the newsroom will be like, can't you just make that? Well, it's like very fast, right? Like, can you just make that? And they'll be like, no, it's actually gonna take like 2 months and we can't do anything else. I'm dealing with that right now. So, you know, I think like you don't need to do that, but you need to understand their work in the same way that like, you can't just have like someone go chase down some news tip because like that actually takes time. So I think like knowing enough about how both of those teams work, enough that you can like have intelligent conversations about it.
So I don't think we really disagree. I think
Damn.
no, because
Darn.
because
so close,
No,
ladies.
because I don't think people have to know all those things I said and many others day one before entering the industry. I mean, not everyone has the luxury to go to school for a million years. You have to get out and you have to start working. But I do think you can learn those things. Plus, now you should be great at writing and you should really understand audio and you should understand video. But you can learn so much of that in your career. And so to go into your career with the idea that you will do different roles, you will listen, you will learn, you will not put yourself in a box, this is all I do. You will try new things, you will learn those things. And Millie, I think you've learned a lot of those different things in your roles. Yes. So I think it's just a matter of, you know, being a lifelong learner and understanding that all these different areas are important. And if you go in, if you're not sophisticated in data going in, pay attention when your newsroom has a training session and so on. Go to it and pay attention to it, you know.
Oh, I think one other thing you can do, just like to engage your like product thinking muscles, is think about like what products you actually like to use, and like how could it be better, and like this microphone is a great product. It's like really serving my need to like speak to you. Like there's like a water bottle I really like. Why do I like it? Like, you know, product design can be a bunch of different things, and like once you get into product design, you can think about like IDEO, which makes new products, but like think about your, like open a news app, think about like what makes it good. Like, do you like the push alerts? Do you like the choices they give you? Do you like the way you like can navigate different things? And like, I think taking a more critical eye to current products you already use is a good way to like just learn about it.
This hour flew by, and while we did not manage to find huge disagreements, we really tried when we kind of planned that panel. But it's, you know, I hope you still got something out of it. Thank you all for coming to listen to us with that big competition going on. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Millie, for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.